In 1501, something extraordinary happened that would reshape the world forever, and almost nobody noticed. A Portuguese navigator sailed past a coastline so vast, so untouched, that it would soon transform global trade, wealth, and power. But here's what's shocking. Portugal had no idea what they'd actually discovered. They thought they were somewhere else entirely. This is the true story of how one voyage accidentally changed everything, and how the richest nation on earth almost came from a mistake. The year was 1501. Europe was buzzing with news of Columbus's voyages to what everyone believed was Asia. Kings and merchants were desperate to find the fastest route to the spice markets of the East, where pepper, cloves, and nutmeg were worth more than gold. Portugal, the world's leading maritime power, wasn't about to let Spain get ahead. They had spent decades perfecting ocean navigation, and they knew the Atlantic held secrets. What they didn't expect was a continent standing directly in the way. When Portuguese navigator Gaspar Correal led an expedition down the Atlantic coast that year, he was officially exploring new territories for the Portuguese crown. But the scale of what he encountered was beyond imagination. The shoreline stretched endlessly, with dense forests reaching inland beyond the horizon. Rivers fed into the ocean with such force that fresh water could be tasted miles offshore. The vegetation was unlike anything Europeans had ever catalogued: thick, impenetrable jungle filled with sounds of animals no naturalist had documented. Correal and his crew mapped sections of this massive coastline, carefully recording every inlet, every river mouth, every geographical feature. They didn't immediately realize they were exploring an entirely unknown continent. The mapping itself was the triumph of precise measurements, detailed charts, and careful notes that would form the foundation for understanding this territory's true location and significance. Here's what most history books get wrong. Portugal didn't celebrate this discovery immediately. They kept it secret for years. Portugal quickly understood the magnitude of their discovery. This wasn't Asia. This was something new. A landmass so extensive that it demanded explanation, mapping, and eventually colonization. The implications were staggering. If Spain had found a path to the Indies, Portugal had found something equally precious: an entire continent waiting to be explored, exploited, and claimed. To understand why Portugal in 1501 possessed the technology and courage to venture into unknown waters, you need to step back 20 years. Portugal didn't just stumble into being the world's greatest maritime nation. They built it methodically through investment, innovation, and obsession with the sea. Prince Henry the Navigator, who died in 1460, had established a school of navigation in Sagres, Portugal. This wasn't just a training facility. It was a research institution. Mathematicians, cartographers, astronomers, and experienced sailors gathered to solve the practical problems of long-distance ocean navigation. They developed improved astrolabes for measuring latitude. They created better maps and refined techniques for reading the stars. They experimented with ship designs that could handle both powerful ocean swells and the calmer waters near coastlines. By 1501, Portugal had 4 decades of accumulated knowledge. Portuguese ships, called caravels, were engineering marvels. Smaller than earlier European vessels, but incredibly maneuverable. They featured lateen sails that allowed ships to sail closer to the wind. This gave Portuguese mariners unprecedented ability to explore in any direction, not just with favorable winds. The design meant they could navigate coastal waters without becoming trapped by unfavorable conditions. Equally important was Portugal's economic motivation. The spice trade from Asia generated enormous wealth for whoever controlled the routes. Venice and Genoa acted as middlemen, buying spices in the Mediterranean and selling them at massive markups throughout Europe. Portugal wanted to break this monopoly by finding a direct sea route around Africa to India. Every expedition down the African coast brought them closer to this goal. By 1501, Portuguese explorers had already rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488. They were on the verge of reaching India by sea. In this context, the discovery of Brazil wasn't their primary mission, it was an unexpected complication. Yet Portugal's infrastructure, technology, and fearless approach to exploration meant they were perfectly positioned to recognize its value when they found it. But here's the irony nobody talks about. The very technologies that allowed Portugal to discover Brazil would eventually be used by their enemies to steal it. The crews that sailed for Portugal weren't just brave, they were trained. They understood celestial navigation, mathematics, and the careful record-keeping necessary to create accurate charts. When Gaspar Correal encountered the Brazilian coast, he had the knowledge to map it properly and the communication networks to ensure the information reached the Portuguese crown and cartographers quickly. Gaspar Correal's expedition set sail from Lisbon with the latest charts, instruments, and supply ships. The typical transatlantic voyage took 6 to 8 weeks, though this depended entirely on winds and currents. The ships followed a route that would carry them southwest from Portugal, hoping to reach the Americas and eventually find the passage to Asia that every explorer desperately sought. The Atlantic crossing was genuinely dangerous. Storms could destroy ships without warning. Supplies of fresh water dwindled as weeks passed. Scurvy, a disease caused by vitamin C deficiency, began affecting crew members around the second month. Depending on their route, ships could encounter floating ice, unexpected currents, or calm waters where they'd be stuck for days. The psychological toll of sailing into the unknown, with no guarantee of finding land or returning safely, created constant tension among the crew. When Correal's ships finally encountered the American coast in 1501, the experience was overwhelming. The explorers sailed northward along what we now know as the Brazilian coast, probably starting near the mouth of the Amazon River. What they encountered was a coastline of staggering proportions. The vegetation was so thick and foreign that early explorers literally couldn't comprehend what they were seeing. The trees were enormous, with intertwining branches and dense vines. The rivers were gigantic. The Amazon alone discharges more water than any other river on Earth, creating a distinctive pattern in the Atlantic Ocean that early sailors would have noticed immediately. Correal documented everything. His crew took soundings of water depth, noted the direction and strength of currents, recorded the latitude using astronomical observations, and described the terrain in detail. These weren't casual observations. They were systematic measurements that would later be compiled into maps. The Portuguese understood that accurate information about unknown territories had immense value for future expeditions, military strategy, and commercial opportunity. Yet Correal himself would eventually disappear at sea, and history would give credit for this voyage to other explorers. What made this voyage genuinely significant was that Correal's charts and reports convinced the Portuguese crown that Brazil was real, substantial, and worth serious attention. Within the first decade of the 1500s, multiple Portuguese expeditions were mapping the Brazilian coast. By 1502, another explorer, João Coelho, was exploring further south. The information accumulated rapidly, creating an increasingly detailed picture of this enormous territory. The indigenous people living along the coast, the Tupi and other groups, would have observed these ships with confusion and alarm. They had never seen European vessels or European people. For them, the arrival of these explorers marked the beginning of catastrophic change, though the full impact wouldn't be felt for several more decades. Before 1501, European maps showed the world with significant gaps and errors. The Americas were barely understood. Many cartographers weren't even sure if Columbus had found Asia or something entirely different. Maps of the period featured enormous blank spaces labeled unknown or decorated with mythical creatures and uncertain notations. Coelho's expedition created detailed charts of a previously unknown coastline. These charts were preserved carefully because they possessed immediate practical value. Portuguese cartographers integrated this new information into updated maps. Within a few years, European mapmakers could show the Brazilian coast with reasonable accuracy, a dramatic change from complete ignorance. The shocking part, within weeks of these maps being circulated, Portugal's rivals had stolen copies. The maps created from Coelho's voyage revealed something astonishing. The coastline ran roughly north to south for an enormous distance. This meant the continent wasn't a small island or a western extension of Asia, was a major geographical feature. The rivers entering the ocean at specific points provided landmarks that ships could use for navigation. The latitude measurements established by the explorers allowed future mariners to relocate the same areas with increasing precision. Most importantly, the accurate mapping of Brazil created immediate practical implications for European imperial competition. Spain and Portugal had signed the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, just 7 years earlier. This treaty attempted to divide the New World between the two powers. The treaty drew a line 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. Territories east of this line belonged to Portugal. Territories west belonged to Spain. At the time the treaty was signed, nobody fully understood where this line actually fell in relation to the American continents. The maps created from 1501 onward clarified the situation. The Brazilian coast fell almost entirely east of the treaty line, meaning Portugal could legitimately claim it. This wasn't just geographical achievement. It was the foundation for one of history's most valuable colonial territories. The accurate positioning of Brazil on European maps also triggered investment and planning. Portuguese merchants immediately began envisioning how to exploit the territory. What resources existed? What could be extracted? Could settlements be established? Could this territory eventually rival the Spice Islands in economic importance? These weren't abstract questions. They were the basis for colonial expansion that would dominate the next 3 centuries. Early explorers returning from the Brazilian coast reported abundant resources that seemed extraordinarily valuable to European minds. The forests contained hardwoods, particularly a red dye-producing wood that became known as pau-Brasil, literally Brazil wood. This wasn't just any export. Red dye was desperately needed by European textile industries. The deep red color it produced was so prized that the wood commanded extremely high prices in European markets. Brazilian hardwoods had another advantage. They were genuinely superior to European alternatives for specific applications. The strength, durability, and color characteristics made them essential for shipbuilding, furniture making, and decorative work. A Portuguese merchant could purchase pau-Brasil in Brazil for minimal cost, essentially just the effort of cutting and transporting it, and sell it in Lisbon, Venice, or other European ports for enormous profit margins. Beyond the timber, early explorers reported other treasures. The region contained medicinal plants unknown in Europe. The soil appeared fertile, suggesting that European crops could be established. There were indications of mineral wealth, though precious metals weren't immediately discovered in significant quantities. Animals unfamiliar to Europeans roamed the territory, species that might provide valuable materials like hides and furs. Perhaps most significantly, the early explorers reported that indigenous people possessed items that suggested advanced trade networks. Feathers from rare birds were particularly valuable. These suggested connections to other territories inland, potentially leading to even greater treasures. The possibility that Brazil might serve as a gateway to undiscovered riches inland drove Portuguese interest even more intensely. The indigenous population itself represented a resource in Portuguese eyes. Labor for extraction of timber and other materials required enormous effort. Enslaving indigenous people to perform this labor seemed economically logical to Portuguese planners, particularly because slavery was still an accepted practice in European society. The labor question was critically. Europe didn't have a sufficient surplus population to establish colonies thousands of miles away. Indigenous people, perceived as abundant and available, offered a solution. The uncomfortable truth: Portugal's decisions in Brazil became the template for slavery systems that would eventually enslave 12 million African people over the next 3 centuries. Within 20 years of Courel's voyage, Portuguese colonization began in earnest. The first major settlement was established in the 1520s. Portuguese merchants and settlers arrived, bringing European diseases and violence. They established sugar plantations, which quickly became the dominant economic force in Brazil. Sugar was intensely labor-demanding and incredibly profitable. The need for labor to work these plantations drove the escalation from slavery of indigenous people to the later introduction of enslaved African people, a trade that would devastate millions and continue for centuries. News of Portugal's discovery of Brazil spread throughout Europe with remarkable speed. Spanish merchants and navigators studied Portuguese maps and reports obsessively. French explorer Jean Denis organized expeditions northward along the American coast, seeking territories that might lie west of the Tordesillas line and therefore be claimable by France. English merchants began planning voyages to explore further north, in territories they hoped wouldn't fall under either the Spanish or Portuguese treaties. The competition was fierce and sometimes violent. Portuguese expeditions encountered French ships already establishing trading posts along the Brazilian coast. Without formal military outposts, Portuguese control existed mainly on paper. French merchants were entirely willing to trade directly with indigenous people for pau-Brasil and other goods, undercutting Portuguese monopoly aspirations. The same occurred with English merchants and other European traders. This competition drove accelerated colonization. Portugal needed to establish actual settlements, not just claim territory through maps and treaties. Military forts were built to control key coastal points. These weren't impressive fortifications, simple structures designed to withstand ship-based attacks and indigenous resistance, but they represented Portugal's commitment to holding the territory against competitors. The presence of these colonial establishments changed everything for indigenous peoples. Portuguese settlers demanded tribute, enslavement, and conversion to Christianity. Those who resisted faced military violence. Those who cooperated found themselves increasingly dependent on European goods and vulnerable to European diseases. Within a generation, the demographic catastrophe was underway. Indigenous populations declined by 90% or more in some areas, primarily due to diseases like smallpox and measles, to which they had no immunity. Spain, despite controlling much of the American territory to the west, increasingly viewed Brazil with frustration. The territory wasn't producing the gold and silver that enriched Spanish colonies in Mexico and Peru. Yet it fell under Portuguese control through the Tordesillas Treaty. This resentment would fester for centuries. Eventually, Spain would attempt to seize Brazil directly, and Portugal would lose and regain the territory multiple times during the colonial period. Remarkably, Portugal actually lost Brazil to Spain for 60 years, and nobody remembers it. The competition between European powers over Brazilian territory was fundamentally about economics. The colonies that could be established in the Americas represented the future wealth of European nations. Those left without American territories faced relative decline. This competition would drive European imperialism for the next 4 centuries, reshaping the world through colonization, slavery, and extraction of resources from the Americas and eventually Africa and Asia. Standing here in 2025, it's easy to overlook how dramatically 1501 changed the world. But consider what emerged directly from Cabrillo's voyage and Portugal's decision to colonize Brazil. Brazil became the largest Portuguese-speaking nation on Earth. Today, it's the 9th largest economy in the world and contains over 200 million people. The Portuguese language, spoken by more than 250 million people globally, spread significantly through Brazilian colonization. More broadly, the mapping and colonization of Brazil in 1501 accelerated European imperialism across the globe. The technologies, organizational structures, and justifications developed for colonizing Brazil were applied to conquering other territories. The ship designs, navigation techniques, and colonial administrative systems became templates. The brutal logic of slavery and resource extraction established in Brazil would be replicated in Africa, India, and elsewhere. The economic success of Brazilian sugar production, built entirely on slavery, drove European demand for slaves and created the machinery that would ultimately enslave millions of African people. The ecological consequences of colonizing Brazil were equally dramatic. Forests that had existed for millennia were cleared for sugar plantations and other agriculture. This deforestation continues today. The Amazon rainforest, the world's largest tropical forest and a crucial buffer against climate change, faces destruction, partly rooted in Portuguese colonial decisions made 500 years ago. The patterns of land ownership and resource extraction established in 1501 continue shaping Brazil's environmental policies. Most viewers don't realize this. The Amazon rainforest today covers only 80% of its original extent. The rate of destruction is accelerating, not slowing down. For Portugal specifically, Brazil became the jewel of their colonial empire. While Spanish colonies produced gold and silver that enriched Spain in the short term, Brazil's sugar wealth produced steady, enormous profits over centuries. Portuguese merchants became extraordinarily wealthy. This wealth funded Portugal's role in global commerce, intellectual development, and eventually, Portugal's survival as an independent nation during periods when Spain threatened to absorb it. The indigenous peoples of Brazil, millions of them, were devastated by colonization. Their civilizations, cultures, and population were largely destroyed. Descendants of survivors face ongoing marginalization and struggle for basic rights. The historical injustice of colonization remains unresolved in Brazil and across the Americas. The voyage of 1501 was presented as an achievement of exploration and navigation, and it was. Colonial and his crew possessed genuine skill and courage, yet it also initiated a process that would prove catastrophic for indigenous peoples and would establish patterns of global inequality that persist today. Gaspar Corel mapped a coastline, but he initiated a process that would reshape the entire world. His voyage is a perfect example of how historical moments that seem triumphant in one context carry profound moral weight from another perspective. Understanding 1501 means acknowledging both the genuine achievement and the horrific consequences that followed.